morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Sauer. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning for the network, and welcome to the network's Friday Forum, Walking the Talk, Practical Applications for Equity Transformations in Nonprofits. Thank you so much for joining. This is the final week in our series of forums that we've hosted weekly over the past month. This series concludes with a final panel today at 1 p.m. on re-entry supportive housing programs with guests from Los Angeles. The link to register for that panel is in the chat. I would like to thank our sponsors and nonprofit partners who generously supported this series. And please check out our exhibitor gallery. The link, you know where it is, it's in the chat. We're going to reserve some time at the end of this discussion for audience Q&A, so please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A function with the button at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A. We'd also love to hear from you in the chat, so please introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from, and respond to anything that resonates throughout the discussion. After this forum, we also invite you for a quick post-forum chat with some of our panelists between 11 and 11:15 a.m. So a separate Zoom link is going to be made available for that. It will be in the chat, and it also was in the registration reminder email you received. So on to the content of today's panel. Many of our organizations have invigorated or renewed their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism after last summer's uprising following the murder of George Floyd and countless others. And many of us are also wondering, after the statements and commitments, what comes next? So we've gathered an amazing group of nonprofit leaders for this panel to share some concrete steps they are taking with their organizations to further these ideals. Our moderator today is Jeannette Ruffins, Chief Executive Officer of Homeward NYC and Network Board Member. Thanks, Jeannette. I'll pass it over to you.
I can't believe 17 months in and I still forgot to unmute myself. So my name is Jeannette Ruffins and I'm the CEO of Homeward NYC, and I am really excited to be facilitating this panel today. I think many of us, even before George Floyd and certainly after George Floyd's death, have been really kind of struggling to figure what our agencies should be doing to address issues of racial inequality, equity, inclusion. And so we really do have a fabulous panel today. And I am not going to do their bios, so they will talk briefly about themselves and their agency work. I think that that's the important part of the conversation. And honestly, an hour is not that long. So I would like to introduce them. Pascale Leone, VP Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Belonging at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Pascale, you turn your camera on.
Same, after 17 months.
Okay.
So good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, well, I can. Dr. Myra Henry, President and CEO at the YWCA of Rochester and Monroe County. You say good morning?
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Fiona, I know I'm gonna mess this up. Kanagasingam? I didn't say that right. Fiona, can you pronounce your last name, please?
Sure. No, you got it, Kanagasingam.
Oh, Chief Equity and Learning Officer at Planned Parenthood of Greater New York. And Dayneen Caldwell, Chief Human Capital and Compliance Officer at Women in Need. I love the Chief Human Capital part of that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
So much better than HR. All right, so, we're gonna jump right into this because as I said before, an hour is not that long and we wanna leave time for a very vigorous discussion. So we'll start with Pascale.
Thank you so much, Jeannette, and good morning, everyone. It's so great to be in community with you all. Again, my name is Pascale Leone. I use the she, her pronouns, and I identify as an Afro-Caribbean woman. And so I would also like to start just by acknowledging the land that I'm calling in from and joining you today. I'm calling in from Long Island, New York, which is the unceded territory of the Munsee clan of the Lenape people. And so I want to extend my gratitude and my appreciation to the original inhabitants of this land that I'm raising my family. And so for my day job, I work as the VP of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And essentially, in short, I work with my colleagues and peers to build an anti-racist, multicultural race equity culture at CSH. And so I've been with the organization now for close to 8 years, but serving in this capacity for almost 2 years. And what a 2 years it's been. But fortunately, the work started, and like many organizations, started before I took this position, before the reckoning for racial and economic and housing justice really came to a fore in what we saw in 2020. Back in 2018, we actually put into our 3-year strategic plan a commitment to race equity, recognizing that we couldn't fulfill our organization's mission without addressing the crippling and destabilizing effects of structural racism, right? And so I know we'll go deeper in the conversations in terms of the specifics of our respective work, but I'll just share, that a framework to get started that we adopted for our transformative organizational change work was from the Policy and Economic Justice kind of think tank, DEMOS. And so I think I'll be sharing this with the network, and we'll be sharing some resources, but they have this racial equity transformation, which is their multifaceted approach and really takes on 4 key phases, right? And these phases should be seen as iterative and not linear, right? Because we go in and out of these phases as the work requires us to do. And so really quickly, the 4 phases are: 1, the foundational analysis, right? This is that critical articulation of why, right? Why we must center racial equity in our work and not just focusing on diversity and the how and the what. Then there's the organizational assessment. And this is the ongoing surveillance of staff to elicit their support for and their understanding of key racial equity concepts, as well as their experience within the organization and the organizational culture, right? And what it means to be a CSHer. In our first assessment we did back in 2019, we learned that what it meant to be a CSHer was really rooted in white dominant culture, right? And so how do we flip that orientation? Third, there's the learning. And simply put, we call this our forever work. As a learning organization, we're all learners and we're all teachers in this space, but the learning here is deliberate. It's the conscious unlearning of deeply ingrained and interpersonal and organizational norms, practices, and culture, and our commitment to learning and trying on new ones. And the fourth one is implementation. And this essentially is like where our commitment really turns into action. This is us institutionalizing the anti-racist policies and practices and standards, that are part of job descriptions, that are part of performance reviews, that are part of ongoing staff development. And that, race equity is deliberately woven into each fabric of our work, both internally and externally, and not, seen as a one-off. And so quickly, what we've done in the past 2 years, and again, there's a lot of work leading up to this, but to start out, we really had to create this group in which I affectionately call Reddit. It's the Racial Equity Design and Implementation Team. And it's a nationally representative group of CSHers, about 24 CSHers charged with drafting and advising and designing and implementing the initial implementation of our racial equity framework. And so this group was carefully selected to make sure that we ensure, gender, racial, ethnic, functional, positional, and geographic diversity to really drive this work in a meaningful way. We created a tool for our partners, which folks may have seen, called the Racial Disparities and Disproportionality Index. And so affectionately, we call that the RDDI, and you can find that by going to csh.org/data. And essentially the RDDI, it examines 17 unique public systems. So everything from sheltered and unsheltered homelessness to jails and prisons, mental health institutions and nursing homes. And it disaggregates systems level data by race and ethnicity, right? And it measures the disparities as well as the disproportionality among these groups in all 50 states across these 17 systems and Washington, D.C. And essentially it helps practitioners on the ground to use this aggregated data to identify, the inequities not only in systems access, but systems flow, as well as the disparate outcomes that we see, allowing them to really, go upstream to address the root causes of the inequities that we're witnessing. We also created an internal racial equity impact assessment tool, which serves as a systematic analysis, right, that goes through like 25 questions that essentially looks at how do different racial, ethnic, and other minoritized groups may be affected by a decision, policy, or program that CSH advances. We establish affinity and caucus groups, as well as, which I think is the most important piece, the intentional fostering of the learning journey in our forever work, right? And so we have all staff trainings, as well as monthly race equity calls to understand how we operationalize that work and to hear from our peers across the organization, as well as monthly internal blogs celebrating culture and identity. When I first started this position, I wanted to make clear that, you know, staff don't have to leave their identity at the door when they walk to the office in the morning or turn on the computer, right? And so how do we, you know, come with our full, beautiful, authentic, and whole selves, understanding that, you know, as a work environment, it is a culture, it is a community. And so how do we co-create one that is built on inclusivity and belonging? And so, yeah, so that's just a highlight of what we've done. I look forward to hearing from our colleagues and talking and sharing more about our journey. Thanks, Jeannette. Oh yeah, I think you're on mute.
Okay, Dr. Henry.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for having me here with these esteemed panelists. This is really an honor, and yeah, I'm gonna just jump right in. So I'm Dr. Myra Henry, President and CEO of the YWCA of Rochester and Monroe County, way upstate, right near Canada. And at the YWCA, we provide various housing supports for women and their families in our community, including emergency housing, supportive living for women in recovery, long-term housing, as well as affordable apartments within the community. We also have a young adult services department that provides instructional and supportive parenting best practices for parents who are under the age of 29, as well as with children from 0 to 5 years old. We do all of that through a racial equity lens. And that's kind of what excites me about this work and the work that we do. As a purpose-driven organization whose mission is to eliminate racism and empower women, the YWCA of Rochester and Monroe County is intentional about weaving the tenets of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging throughout our agency. And it starts internally with our organizational structure. And I'll just add there that I've been in this seat as president and CEO for 6 months, just about 7 months. I started December 1st. So we are new, we are beginning our journey to becoming an organization of belonging and an anti-racist organization. But in doing so, in that 6 months, we've made some really major strides towards this initiative. So we use, similar to what Pascale said, we use a framework, which is the Strategic Diversity Leadership Framework developed by researcher Dayneen Williams to put words into action. Applied with an equity lens, we are currently going through the 5 dimensions of the Strategic Diversity Leadership Framework to become a workplace of belonging where staff can thrive. Those 5 dimensions are organizational learning, structural, community, political, and symbolic leadership. Now, what does that mean and how does it look day to day? First, we started with, and this is gonna really just expand upon what Pascale has just shared. First, we started with acknowledging and learning from our past. For example, I am the first Black woman of color, president and CEO in the agency's 138-year history. That means something. We realized we were working from an antiquated organizational framework that perpetuated decades of systemic institutional racism and trauma. So as a result, we saw this as an opportunity to reimagine and redefine leadership by intentionally calling out inequities, breaking down barriers, and creating pathways where program managers and supervisors, who are mostly Black, Indigenous people of color, are elevated and respected as organizational leaders within our agency. We did so by creating a strategic or senior leadership team and an organizational leadership team to be more representative of the people we serve and to move our mission forward. We also provide additional leadership opportunities through various committee work for all staff who may not be in traditional leadership roles. Now, the last thing I'll share, we've also established a Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Action Committee who is charged with the development and implementation of YWCA's DEI change agenda. This committee of staff and board members, I serve as the executive sponsor for this committee, has three main objectives. First, to identify best practices, challenges, and strategic approaches to foster an equitable and inclusive environment for our staff, residents, and clients. Second objective, to focus on initiatives that move our mission forward from the inside out. And then lastly, to work together toward building individual and organizational awareness, knowledge, and skills as it relates to issues of power, privilege, and oppression that impact the intersections of racial equality, women's empowerment, and social justice in our work at YWCA. Now, it's important to acknowledge this is hard work, and this work is a journey. And we must take time to recognize that everyone is entering this journey in different spaces. The important thing is that we are not alone on this journey. We will do it together. We will work together toward a more just and equitable society as we work to impact the lives of women and their families in our community.
Thank you, Dr. Henry. So next is Fiona.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Fiona CanagaSingham. My pronouns are she and her. I am the Chief Equity and Learning Officer at Planned Parenthood of Greater New York. So just for context, Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, or PPGNY, is an affiliate as part of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. We are the largest affiliate in the country, and we are a leading provider of and advocate for sexual and reproductive health, which includes and will always include abortion rights and a whole range of other sexual and reproductive health services. To provide some context, so my role was a role that was created before a lot of the racial reckoning that happened across the country, right, last summer. But obviously last summer amplified a lot of what was happening. This was a role that was created partly due to pressure within the organization, but also from sexual and reproductive justice leaders who have been pushing Planned Parenthood for a long time to reckon with our own legacy and complicity within the eugenics movement, which has harmed communities of color. So it's come out of that organizing both within and outside the institution. And so that's the context. The other part of the context I wanted to share is that in addition to being the largest affiliate in the country, we also straddle much of New York State, which is a very geographically and culturally diverse state. And so that also creates specific tensions for the work, right? To do this work with about 600 staff that scattered across the state. My role is to center equity with a focus on racial justice and equity in particular across the institution, across all of our programs and operations. And so this means not just looking at staff experience, but really going to the heart of patient experience, where we see that there are disparities in access, not just in terms of who tends to come to us, who has access to our services, but also even when our patients come to us, we see that in particular, patients of color, in particular, Black patients, have a poorer experience even after they access our services, right? And so it really is going to the heart of institutional transformation to nurture an anti-racist and multicultural institution where all staff and community can thrive. So there are a couple of foundational principles that anchor our work, and there's a set of practices and protocols that are built around those principles. So I want to share those, and I will also share this the plan and report with anyone who wants this after this session. A couple of things in how we approached our work. One was that, you know, organizational assessment is an ongoing way of understanding what is happening, right? And this is not just through a survey. I mean, I think I often say we don't need to survey staff and patients to know that systemic racism is alive and well within the institution, but really creating a space where we can constantly get that information qualitatively as well as quantitatively. And so assessing organizational dynamics so that we can actually face it is a part of it. You know, we do gather data regularly and disaggregate all of that data by race and gender so that we can see how a single institution is creating different experiences, disparate experiences for our community, whether internal or external. We facilitate staff dialogues through monthly meetings that are focused on equity so that some of that experience of the institution is also surfaced through those forums. So that's sort of one piece, assessing organizational dynamics. Another part of it is really reckoning with our history and legacy. And so as part of the work that we have been doing internally, we also have engaged in a process to listen to community, to understand and hear and uplift how community has been impacted by Planned Parenthood's legacy, right? And so this has been through an initiative called Reviving Radical, which is really about reckoning with our founder, Margaret Sanger's support for the eugenics movement and the harmful impact of that on women of color, people with disabilities, and poor communities at the dawn of the birth control movement. And then the other principle is really naming and framing it with a race explicit analysis. And I mean, this is something that we've learned from multiple other organizations who have done this work even before us, that it is really important for multiple reasons when we do equity work to have an anti-oppressive lens, to look at all the different systems, including gender, sexuality that impact experience, but we want to center race, right? So race and racism are always on the table in terms of how we address issues when we talk, for example, about the impact on trans communities. So as an example, Planned Parenthood provides gender affirming care for trans and non-binary patients. And we want to talk very specifically about how issues of access and experience impact trans folks of color. And so we always want race and racism to be part of the conversation. And I think one of the things I know from my own experience doing this work is that if we're not dealing explicitly with racism, we often cannot really deal with all of the other systems. And there is a particular way in which race and racism are the elephant in the room, right? So every time we talk about it, people want to talk about class, they want to talk about gender, want to talk about sexuality. And so that again is part of how we approach this. We have an equity school initiative, which is part of mandatory onboarding for all new staff, but current staff also opt in and are trained around some of these key principles, trained around a racial analysis and also our own legacy. And that's been a part of the way in which we've anchored this principle in organizational culture. The second to last piece I wanted to share is really around a focus on systems rather than just learning. So I often say that we cannot train our way out of racism. And what that means really is that we need to change systems and build systems of accountability so that everyone's got to do something regardless of where they are in their own journey, right? So this has meant creating new protocols for how we hire, creating new protocols for how we deliver clinical care, so that there are systems built and that people are held accountable for. There's promotions policies to increase pathways and reduce bias and barriers for staff of color who experience a lot of institutional racism. And so that's kind of part of it. And then the last principle is really structuring for results. And so we have made a very intentional effort to separate this function from human resources and other functions so that it has its own structure. My role reports directly to the CEO, and I have a small department of folks who does this work so that we can really embed equity across all of our programs, services, and operations. So I'll stop there and happy to take any questions after the session, after the panelists speak.
Thank you, Fiona. Dayneen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel with all of these trailblazers, if you will, in this work. I also consider myself as a trailblazer in this work. I started in diversity. It was only called diversity when I started, which was in the early 90s. You can't see the gray because I do color my hair from time to time, not always, but starting this work that early in a financial services organization that really needed it, to say the least. It was interesting to see people who looked like me in leadership positions, but I was fortunate enough to be selected to be in an executive program. And the work was innate, if you will. It was something that needed to happen in the early 90s. And unfortunately, the organization wasn't receptive to what I was doing. So I met underground for 2 years, planting the seeds for the work that eventually the global organization embraced. That organization is JP Morgan Chase. At the time that I started the work, in the early 90s, it was always Chase. So all of the other mergers that came afterwards, the chemical merger, the JP Morgan merger, were after my stay in the organization. Actually during my stay, but the work had already started and we just planted the seeds globally. So back then, I was responsible for setting up 30 affinity groups across a global organization. And it was the time where it needed to happen back then. So I feel like I'm in a rebirth of the movement that's happening right now, going full circle. As Jeannette did in the introduction, my name again, Dayneen Caldwell, and I am the Chief Human Capital and Compliance Officer at WIN, Women in Need. We are the largest provider of homeless shelters in New York City. And if you think about the organization, I continue to hear people say that this is hard work. And I'm not going to say it's not, but it wasn't for me. Because of this being in my DNA and what I believe in, I can't work for an organization that doesn't get it. So it is the very first thing I do. And joining the organization 3 years ago, actually, a month now in May, I noticed that the organization didn't have a diversity statement. So that was the very first thing that needed to happen, is that, we have to institutionalize and make sure our organization realizes the commitment to this work. So writing the diversity statement, getting the buy-in from the C-suite, institutionalizing it in the organization, building it into the fiber of our values, changing our organizational values. You have no idea what a hill that was to climb. Putting it in a handbook, and then the work had begun. But again, I just joined 3 years ago. So it's an interesting timeline for the organization, because starting any new organization, and while you're trying to assess the organization and put an infrastructure in place to support the work that you need to do, it took me about a year to really come back to it. I mean, we had it in the orientation, it was in the handbook, so the seed had been planted. But it wasn't until 2019 that we started. I said, okay, I gotta come back to this. And we started with a training for the executive team, so the entire management team. And the first bit of that training was on undoing racism and unconscious bias training. We spent quite a bit of money to have an outside consultant come in and do this training in different layers over 3 days to get all of the management team, every manager in the organization. We got the feedback, we built the blueprint, work is happening, everything is moving forward. And then the next year, right, the travesty of the murder of George Floyd. So I kind of look at this work pre-George Floyd's murder and post-George Floyd's murder, right? Because the whole world woke up and all of a sudden jobs started being created for this work. Fiona said, she was brought on before the post-George Floyd movement in this space. But if you look at the amount of DE&I jobs that were created and consultancy, people that I did this work and started with are brushing off their, consultant portfolios and now are like getting hired, like you can't even imagine. So the work was interesting to see it all come to life, and all of a sudden everybody is shining a light on it. So I didn't use a blueprint. I kind of just know how this work happens. And, you know, I had already did the organizational assessment. And for me, fortunate that I came from I'm still there. I'm in an organization that was extremely diverse. But for me, I knew how to get this done because I wrote the blueprint to this work. I'm not going to say how many years ago, but for an organization that didn't understand people like me. So I went directly to the bottom line and I looked at the strategy and what are you trying to create? And let me show you how this work is going to impact how you're perceived by all of your stakeholders, entice other stakeholders and funders to be a part of this work. So I went to the data. First, I needed a baseline. Let me look at the demographics of the organization. But more importantly, before I went to the demographics of the organization, I went to the demographics of our client base, because that is how you do this. You have to show how what your internal work you're doing is going to impact your client base. And that was important. And back in the 90s, when the CEO of JP Morgan, at that time it was Chase, when we had all of these branches in our community and you walked into the door in ethnic communities, you saw no one who looked like you. That was an easy fix for Chase, right? If you don't start intentionally hiring diverse individuals who are in your banks that reflect the community that you're in, you're going to have a problem here, right? Because they're going to go someplace that they feel comfortable, that people look and speak and understand their history, and that's where they're going to give their money to. Similar concept, it does work today. Understand your clientele, look at the demographics of your current employee base, and see if it mirrors. Pretty similar even to now your board. That probably was the interesting challenge and probably the only one. And I'll come back to that at the end. But for us, fortunate enough that our C-suite is 60% diverse. How wonderful is that? When I looked at our current promotions just over this last year, out of the 80 people that we promoted in 1 year, 67 of them were women, 32 were male. The ethnicity of those 80 individuals, 62% were African American, 18.75% was Latinx, 16% were Caucasian, and 1.5% were 2 or more races. I speak with data, and I was pretty okay with math, but I know that this work that ties to the bottom line, and my CFO, who I partner very closely with, I have to be able to tell them this is why we need to focus on this. This is why this work is important. And for me, really, really for me, I can't do this without the commitment, because if you're not committed to the outcomes, don't even ask. This is too passionate for me. This work means too much. So I built in. I didn't start with a budget, but I'm like, this is what I need, you know, and I think about the money that I spent over this last year and even the year before, you know, building in guest speakers. Some of you may know of one of the early pioneers in this work, Jane Elliott. And when I brought her in, I mean, it was massive, first of all, to be able to get Jane Elliott. But she came in and did a town hall for the entire organization. She's the woman who started with the brown eyes, blue eyes, wearing a collar around your neck. And when I tell you that is long and how far back she did that work, there are people in my organization who didn't know who she was. And that is when it hit them. Because the consultant who did the Undoing Racism and Unconscious Bias training, we actually observed the whole study that she did. And that was the aha moment. So it's thinking about what are you going to put in front of your audience first that's going to crystallize it for them, because this work is important. So again, being extremely fortunate that I do have a very diverse organization. When I look at the demographics of who's coming in, what our current ratios are, fortunate enough to, again, that I have to make sure that not only is my current population of individuals diverse, but everybody we bring into the organization. So it's part of what we look at. That is the lens that we look through for everything. So even looking at our last candidate slate, individuals that we looked at, looking at the demographics over the last year, I just want to look at, because I was critically important for me, because this is criteria, right? Otherwise, individuals who are coming into the organization just won't maintain the diversity. So out of the 2,500 applicants that we got, and for the 39 requisitions, again, 62% female, 32 male, ethnicity 41%, Black 15%, Caucasian 5% Asian, and 3% 2 or more, and some that did not identify. So it is work that you constantly have to be aware of and focus on, and ensure that your existing demographic of your employee base and the new ones coming in reflect the work that you're trying to do. I know I've run out of time. There's so much more to talk about. I haven't even tipped the iceberg of what we've accomplished in the last year. But thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dayneen. So we do have one question in the chat. I'm going to start with that, and then I have lots of other comments. So we have a question that says, what might some strategies be to begin to center the issues of power and privilege in an organizational culture that is very hierarchical and where those in power seem to be interested in only hoarding this power? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think you can look at it through a lens of succession planning and thinking about the ones in power will not always be the ones in power. As I said, over this last year, there were a lot of people at leading organizations in C-suite positions that were let go because these were the individuals that were at the top, but they didn't respond immediately. CEOs were let go. Their second in commands were let go. I mean, that's not something that's very publicized, but if you know where to look, you'll see it. So I think you look at it and you address it through the lens. We need to start thinking about allowing and building succession for the organization. And through that, you try to build in the diversity at that point.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I think that there are a few different pieces to this question, which is really relevant, right? So one is who's actually in leadership, and who's, by that I mean in the leadership team, as well as who leads the organization. And then I think the other part is, regardless of who is there, this work is always about power and privilege, right? So regardless, we have to think about how decisions get made. How do we make sure that these decision-making, regardless of the demographics of the senior leadership team, that decision-making is inclusive. One of the things that we did, is to work on this on two different fronts. And so one, through our hiring protocol, working with the board, we have transformed in the last 1.5 years, the demographics of the leadership team from about 35% people of color to about 75% people of color. Of the people of color on the leadership team, the majority are Black. So that has been part of the demographic shift from very in-depth kind of systematic hiring changes, right? And what we assess for. I think the other part is that it's not just a question of diversity, it's also about equity competencies coupled with all of the other leadership competencies that include inclusive decision-making. And so as part of the work that we've done, and this really is a work in progress, because power replicates itself, right? Regardless of who actually, what the face of it is. And so I do actually really want to say that this is much more than just a question of diversity. It's a really important question. We have a decision-making protocol to evaluate organizational decisions to make sure that, who has been consulted, what are the equity impacts. I will say that it's a work in progress, because very often people with leadership, with power and authority don't like decision-making to be interrupted, right? And so it does require slowing things down. That has been a work in progress. We also have a senior leadership team scorecard, which really looks at embedding equity goals across all organizational functions, which, whether you're a finance person, IT person, clinical lead, like there are equity goals for each of the functions. And again, that's a work in progress to make sure that this is being cascaded through every department from the senior leadership team.
And if I could offer just another thought, I echo their previous sentiments, but I'd also recommend as a practical strategy in bringing in an outside consultant to do some of that power mapping to understand, because there's the visible power we see, but then there's also the behind the scenes, right? The meetings after the meetings, to understand where the power really lies and where those dynamics are, and how white dominant culture really permeates through the organization. You talked about power hoarding, and what is that? Those are alternatives in terms of feeding power. And I think to what was just mentioned in terms of decision-making rubrics and having more transparency and being clear between transparency and consulting, right? When you have an organization of over 150 people, does everyone need to be consulted? But no, right? But are we transparent in how we make decisions? And we have gone through a strategy in our organization of how we've really broken down how we make decisions and opened up our strategic decision-making group to have folks at all levels of the organization to really advance kind of how we position ourselves in our work. And so definitely recommend bringing in someone to help to navigate, and I think folks are more responsive when they hear from someone outside the organization how power and the power hoarding and the lack of feeding power really permeates the organization.
And I'll just add on to that, in looking at consultants as well, I agree with everything that's been said here. Also looking at one's own individual power and privilege in our own sphere of influence. We all have it. We may not necessarily recognize it as power because we don't have the title or the titular leadership responsibilities to say that we are in the decision-making, part of the decision-making process. But we all harness and hone some level of power and privilege within our own sphere of influence. And it's important that we take note of that and know it and know how to leverage it.
So I have a question, and there's a chat in the questions come in. How do nonprofits that serve predominantly BIPOC people and intentionally hire staff that reflect and represent those communities reckon with the extremely low wages and high stress and trauma, the traumatic nature of frontline direct care? Can I just say something and then I'll just let everybody else. So, one of the things that we really do have to do is we, as anybody in the executive staff, should actually always be advocating for the wages that our staff deserve, right? The pandemic, we were all considered essential, and yet we know that we are some of our staff are the lowest paid in the agency and mainly in the sector. So there's a lot of work being done about kind of wage equity, especially for agencies that are primarily government funded. Many of us are primarily in the nonprofit are primarily government funded. So we actually have to push our regional governments to kind of increase those wages. But one of the things we can do is get the workers involved in that fight, right? So me speaking about them, we had a wage equity rally, and it was via Zoom. We had 1,200 people, which I don't know that we could have gotten if it was an in-person rally. But I think all of the mayoral candidates in New York City got to hear directly from the workers who were impacted by it. And so I think we do our staff a service, do ourselves a service, right? When we empower our staff to be advocates on their own behalf. So anyone else want to address that issue? Because we know that low wages is a problem.
I echo those sentiments exactly. I think that getting the staff involved to advocate for themselves and their position is important, and holding their organizations accountable. At least in our area, in our community, we have a Rochester anti-poverty movement that is, that we are a part of. And I would hope that, staff would say, wait a minute, and one of the things they're advocating for is $15 minimum wage, which we adhere to. But if we didn't, I would hope the staff would hold leadership accountable if that was a blind spot that we had. It is important for people to, and it's important for us to create that space for staff to be able to stand up and say, wait a minute, here's some inequities or here's some disparities that I recognize, because, you know, from my seat in this chair, I am, you know, somewhat removed from what happens on the day-to-day. So I often and frequently open and invite staff to come and talk to me, and I go to them. What's happening? What's going on? So I make sure that, yes, that they're advocating and that their voice is elevated, but that I'm also advocating on their behalf, and we're on the same page.
So people are talking, one of the things that people want to ask about is sustainability, right? We don't want this to be a moment in time. We want this to continue. So there've been a couple of things that have come out, putting it in the strategic plan, now having a strategy for decision making, and hopefully, you know, that will be everybody and what are some of the other ways to make it sustainable? Because I think that that's, a lot of people are afraid that it was in response. For a lot of people, it escalated after the death of George Floyd, and it seems like everybody is awake. But how do you, 2 years from now, 10 years from now, this is going to be ongoing work.
Well, I'll just add, you know, that our budgets are our moral documents, right? And so if we are living our values, those are demonstrated in how we budget and resource things. And so this is, as you mentioned, and we've learned, and both at our governance and across the organization have committed to this lifelong work of being a learning organization. And so as such, understanding that this is evolution and not revolution when we think about this work, that this change doesn't happen overnight. And so it must be carefully planned for. It must be communicated, over communicated when you talk about change management. But most importantly, it must be resourced in order to be successful.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I would also add, you know, using your employee resource groups, the ERGs, right, is the transition, if you will, from an ERG to a BRG, business resource group. Because again, if you use your BRGs, or, you know, depending on where you are in your journey, you begin to tap into this group for business decisions and using them as an extension of your operational team and how we need to think in a way that's going to impact the work and tie back to what we're doing. So it's a value add. You know, when we're thinking about how do we do this, we have these ERGs in place. Why not start to tie them to the business strategy? It almost becomes a task force or a task group within your organization. So the relevancy and the value that they add is interwoven into the infrastructure of the organization. They become another additional resource. Funding is critically important as well, building it into the budget, because this work is difficult work. And a lot of organizations start out with using only volunteers. And it starts to take a toll because, you know, people who are passionate about this and who are volunteering, this is in addition to their regular work. So you have to find the balance and start to build it in. And it's small steps, but when an organization can start to see the value coming out of these ERGs or BRGs, business resource groups, they start to get it. And then we start to view everything, every decision through the lens of DE and IMD.
So one of the things that I think, oh, go ahead, Fiona.
Oh, no, I was just going to echo what was just said in terms of budgeting. And it's something that I don't take for granted, especially in a context where we've had a lot of transition at senior levels of the organization, right? Just because it's funded now doesn't mean it will always be funded. And so to really continue to make the case for this work being an ongoing journey, I think is important. It absolutely has to be resourced. I think the other part that I would just add, which speaks to Dr. Caldwell's point on building it into the infrastructure, is that we want to build systems that stick even when people transition, right? So very often in organizations, you have people who are very passionate, sometimes at the highest levels, but then when they leave, the whole equity initiative falls apart. And so it's really important to actually build systems going beyond training, because without the systems of accountability, when people come and go, the initiative can get derailed. So for me, the practices and protocols, how we document what what systems of accountability need to be, how we change clinical protocols around how we deliver care and document them and hold people accountable to it, like that becomes critical work beyond the learning and training type of work.
And Jeannette, I know you have another question, but really quickly adding on to what Fiona said, baking that in through the whole life cycle of the employee, right? From recruitment, orientation, and onboarding, and sunsetting. So making sure that that institutional knowledge and how we do work through an equity lens remains and is carried over from employee to employee.
So just in case we are still talking when it ends, and I don't get to say this, that if people want to join us for 15 additional minutes conversation with the facilitators, there's a link in the chat so that people can join the next meeting. So my last question is, and many of you have already spoken about this, one of the ways in which to get senior staff, or if you aren't in the C-suite, right, to get people to engage, is to help people recognize how the issue affects the clients we serve, right? We are all primarily serving, BIPOC person. That's who we serve, right? And so how did you do that? What are the ways in which you've helped your board, executive management see the impact on the clients we serve? And how investing in DEI is an investment in your long-term future?
Like I said, I've been in the job 6 months. And before I walked in the door, I became very familiar with our data, who we were as the makeup of our organization and the makeup of the people we served. And that serves as my almost North Star, if you will, at the beginning of every meeting, whether it's a staff meeting, a board meeting, or even meeting with other community leaders in our community, understanding who the population it is that we serve and how we want to impact these folks' lives in a way that is equitable, that is kind, and is sincere. But it all starts with the data, and that data has to be refreshed on a regular basis and shared with the organization.
I'll just add that I think we really need to keep asking and answering the question of who we are accountable to, right? So when we do this work, when we do whether it's equity work or just the work that business as usual, the work that we do, we are all, we report to different people. Sometimes we can get lost in those reporting lines. For everyone in the organization, including the board, accountability is to community. And so I think a guiding principle is, if it's not good for community, it's not good. It's not good for us, right? It's not good for the organization. And this can be tricky because even when doing equity work, sometimes, in my own experience, we have at times experienced tensions between staff experience versus patient experience, right? There are things that are good for patients that could involve an additional burden for staff. And we need to be very clear when making those decisions, what is ultimately good for community, and make sure that we're also turning the lens inwards. We cannot do the transformation without also making sure we are looking at staff experience, but it needs to start from community. That's the North Star.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I agree both. It's really about people, data, and accountability, right? How are we ensuring that people who are most impacted, people with lived experience, are part of us making the decisions that will ultimately impact them in community, right? And not just having folks in the beginning or at the end as an afterthought, but really being strategic and intentional about the design of any initiative, policy, or programmatic, that people with lived experience, those who are most impacted, are part of the design of our interventions, as well as the data, right? Data is not the destination though, right? It's important to collect data, but only to inform the practice. And so how are we using our data to be reflective? One example, when we started out, is just really recognizing the folks that we're serving, of course, disproportionately Black and Brown and Indigenous people experiencing homelessness and other challenging needs. And how is that reflected, looking at our organization? I just looked at our own data, just from when we started our strategic plan, our staff being at 25% BIPOC to now over 40%, that was intentional. We wanted to reflect the communities in which we're serving. And then lastly, to Fiona's point, right, accountability, it's really about getting right relationship with community. That's who we're ultimately responsible to. Not, yes, we have responsibilities to funders and government, but ultimately it's to community.
Thank you. This is your opportunity for your last, most important words of wisdom as people start to tackle the work. I would say, remember that the process is iterative and it's not a straight line. I think it can sometimes be frustrating for people when they think everything is moving smoothly in the right direction and then something happens. But one, it is a process and we're in this for the long haul. So it is important to remember that. Moving forward at whatever speed is still moving forward.
I would definitely echo, Jeannette, what you just said, right? We've all heard the saying, this is a journey. There's no destination to this work. I think we need to stay focused on the end of what we are trying to accomplish. I am a firm believer of Stephen Covey and beginning with the end in mind. I always try to think, where am I trying to get to? How am I living my organization's vision and the mission and the values? And everything I do has to be through that lens. This is, work that takes time, investment, empathy. And if we continue to focus on how and where we want to be and look at everything through that lens, I think that is one way to think about this work.
And I'll just add, I'm thinking of Adrienne Marie Brown and thinking that we can only move at the speed of trust and understanding. And so we're all at different points, I think, as you noted, Jeannette, earlier on this journey, right? But we can only move collectively at the speed of trust and understanding. So it's important to have that shared language and so that we're not like speaking past one another, right? And then also, just to be clear, you will make mistakes. Harm will happen, but it's about how do we take responsibility? How do we be accountable? And really that genuine commitment to do better, right? When you know better, you do better.
So we're at time. I really want to thank our excellent panel today and thank all of you for joining. Every time I talk to any of you, I learn. And so that I think is what makes a great workshop. Thank you, everybody. And hopefully you'll join us in the little 15-minute after session. All right, look forward. Take care. Bye.